So Meredith, if we can go to the Anvil story, what made you decided to co-found it Anvil? As you mentioned in your career journey, you have these turning points from biology, doing consulting, working in startup, and now building a product that seems to be for people to create product easily with just
Yes,
using Python. So sounds like a Q basic last time, but in a different way of format.
absolutely. So the background to this is that if this has been your interest through your life, you thought it was an amazingly fun toy. You've been very glad of your opportunity to pick it up and play with it and work out how it works. And then you go and do a PhD that's concentrating on building usable stuff, which means that you're concentrating on all the sharp edges and all the things that make certain sorts of programming extremely human unfriendly. And then one of your best friends you've known since the first day of university is also doing a PhD in human computer interaction. Your sort of over afternoon tea conversations are going to involve a fair amount of ranting about human hostile computer systems. And, every nerd loves a good rant. At a certain point, having really plumbed the depths of ranting about how these days everybody was using systems like the web, where everyone was building for the web. And suddenly you've gone from what we knew in the late 90s, where anybody with a little bit of programming knowledge could pick up a tool like Visual Basic and produce something useful that could be used by an end user because it was just a Windows application like everything else that was being used. We went from a world like that to a world where you must be this tall to ride this ride bar. Only this tall is I need to know JavaScript and HTML and CSS and Python and SQL and React and Redux and Bootstrap and Flask and SQL Alchemy and Webpack and AWS and Git. And I've already run out of fingers. It's just such a horrible environment. This is such a productive medium. There is no good reason to put those obstacles in the way of someone who just wants to build something that can be usable by an end user. You should not have to go through that obstacle course to make something with a button that does something useful when you click it. This frustration had been bubbling along in the backs of our minds, and eventually somebody ought to build something a little bit like Visual Basic for the web. Since nobody seems to be getting on with it, we decided that it might as well be us. This was very much started as a fun project. It was at Ian's dining room table. We would noodle around with, okay, what should this thing look like? Let's try building a little bit more. And then we got bit between our teeth and it started going further and faster. Eventually, we put a link to it up on Reddit and they bit our hand off. Suddenly we went, oh, I see, this really is a real business. There are actual people who would find this useful. It's not just a project we find cool. From there on, we stopped doing it in sort of odd days we'd culled from the rest of our jobs, ramped ourselves up to full time and made a proper business of it. So we're now a bootstrap startup based in Cambridge with offices and employees, almost like real boys.
So I think if I can relate this Anvil with the recent low code and no code movement, people these days are talking a lot about all these new technologies. So is Anvil one of the low code, no code platform?
Oh, okay. So let's talk about the nature of the problem here. To be clear, the problem with web development, the thing that makes it so difficult for anybody to learn a little bit of programming, then pick it up and produce something that's actually useful to end users, is the amount of complexity in getting anything working on the web. So people come along, they look at this problem and they go, well, clearly you can't expect a, let's say, manufacturing engineer who has spent their valuable years learning about manufacturing. They haven't been learning about this unwieldy stack of software. They might reasonably want to create something that is usable in their domain in manufacturing. You can't reasonably expect them to pick up this huge mess of tools. And some people look at that and say, oh, well, what that means is that development's too hard, and let's take away this complicated coding stuff and give you a set of flowcharts with boxes and arrows. You can click and drag those things together, and then you can create an end-user usable application without writing any code. Thus, the no-code movement born. But then there's a bit of a problem, because it becomes rapidly apparent that basically anything you have dragged and dropped together out of flowcharts is going to have some serious omissions. You're going to find yourself wanting to do something that your environment doesn't let you do. This is an awful feeling because by this point, you're already trapped. You've already got halfway to what you want. And then you discover that the other half is simply impossible. And that is awful, awful, awful experience. So this movement relented and went, fine, okay. What we're going to do is we're going to give you an opportunity to, when you run out of things that this platform lets you do, you can drop down and write a React component. Now you can do anything you want. And that's sort of tautologically true, because when you run out of things that this system can do, you can just drop down to the mind-bogglingly complex tool set. So they say, okay, well, we're not actually no code. We're low code. You don't have to go and build a full React component often to do what you want. Of course, it doesn't matter how often you need to do it. If you need to know how to do it, then you need to know how to code or have access to somebody who can code using all these complicated web systems to get anything substantial done. And so, strictly speaking, it's better than getting completely stuck in a no-code environment you can't do anything else with. But if you zoom out here, you haven't really avoided the problem. You've put people in an environment where they are going to get themselves stuck, and they're going to end up either with Cthulhu's own flowchart, or they're going to end up with something that literally can't do what they want. And either way, actually, by the time you're pushing the system that far, you're having to think computationally anyway. You might as well be writing code. We have been telling computers what to do for about the last 75 years, give or take. In that time, nobody has found a better way to tell a computer what to do than to write text in a vaguely algebraic programming language. It just seems to be the best we have. Given that we are telling a computer what to do, why not just use that? Well, because it's too complicated. No! The reason that web development is so complicated is not the development, it's the web. So if you are trying to solve the problem that J-random manufacturing engineer sitting on a production line wants to automate some testing system, to take a real world example, you don't say, oh, poor baby, you shouldn't have to learn to code. You say, let you write the 5-line for loop that is actually the logic you want, and then I will clear this other crud out of your way. And so Anvil is, I suppose it is technically low code in that you have to write less code to produce something with Anvil than you would if you were producing it with a traditional 5-tier web application. But what Anvil really is a development environment simple enough that 5-line for loop is enough to make your application work. You can either say this is a system that's trying to take the code away from you, or you could say, no, this is a development environment with a real programming language. And that's why we chose Python, because it has a really extensive ecosystem. It is the world's favorite first language for learners. It's a real programming language. You can pick it up and do something real. You just won't have to deal with all this cruft of putting the logic that you have just written into a web application and deploying it. So Anvil is a sort of anti-low code, anti-no code tool. Anvil's animating principle is that code is good. Code is the right way to express most of the problems we have when we want a computer to do something. And the trick is to make writing the program as complex as your problem and no more. If you can build your user interface with a drag and drop designer, rather than having to write code to generate code in another programming language, the third programming language embedded in it. I mean, HTML has JavaScript and CSS embedded in it. Nightmare. Instead of having to do that, no, that is not essential to expressing your logic. Use a drag and drop designer. What happens when you click a button? Well, no, that is essential to your logic. So when you double click a button in the Anvil designer, it pops up a text editor and you write the Python function that runs when that button gets clicked, because now you're expressing logic, you want some real code. So I would argue that Anvil is not a low-code system. It's the web toolkit we really need, but the categories of the world might disagree. And so we're in this interesting place of sometimes being lumped in with a movement with which I have fundamental philosophical disagreements.